very much, Corinna, for this welcome and this introduction. And thank you for the audience for coming in, at least for the Europeans at this early hours. So now it's working. So the key question for today is, how can we develop conceptual representations, or concepts for short, as core components of thought, starting with non-conceptual representations? And to outline this perspective, I want first to highlight the multidimensionality of conceptual information, and then to highlight and work out the underestimated role of affective and social information in communication. In the third part, I focus on the informational organization of information that is attached to signals and gestures. And I argue that the best way to characterize it is to characterize at least a lot of information as mental files, if they are concerning objects, properties, or events. The aim is to work out a theory that explains the transformation from non-conceptual to conceptual mental representations. So the working hypotheses are, as a starting point to process a concept, consist in having certain epistemic abilities. This start, which I work out first, helps to characterize also conceptual representations independent from having a full linguistic natural language. Second, concepts are transporting multidimensional information. That's an important aspect, as you will see. And this multidimensional information is organized in mental files. If we characterize this organization, we can outline nicely the development from non-conceptual to conceptual representations within this framework. So let me start with the first point. What does it mean to possess concepts? And the idea is that first, concepts are mental representations, which I think is common ground. And second, that having certain epistemic capacities is the constitutive condition for having a concept. So which are those capacities? Here is the suggestion as I spell it out now, looking at a conceptual representation of redness. Of course, we can have non-conceptual representations of the registration of the color red. But what does it mean to have a conceptual representation of redness? I worked out in a paper with Andreas Bartels that the four conditions should be satisfied. We should have a stable representation of a property of being red while dealing with very different objects. So if you have different objects, then you should be able to recognize the color red as instantiated in these different objects. The other way around, focusing on one object, having the same perceptual input, you should be able to distinguish some other properties of the same object, so that it is red, round, and wooden. Furthermore, a relative stimulus independence should be possible, such that if you have a certain perceptual input of a red wooden object, then you should have the possibility to introduce a new stimulus which allows you to focus either on the color or on the material. First, the fourth criterion, we should be able to discriminate redness from related properties. So there should be a minimal net or set of relevant properties available. The representation of being red thereby becomes an instantiation of the dimension of color. We should be able to distinguish red at least from one or two other colors. And it should not be part of the dimension of shape or danger. So these four conditions are nicely implemented in the gray parrot Alex. Irene Pepperberg has shown that Alex learns sound patterns as symbolic labels for 5 different colors, 4 different shapes, and 3 different materials. He could answer the question, what color? Looking at one object, maybe the red wooden square, and answer what color? Red. What shape? Square. So, and he could do that with looking at objects which are not used in the training phase and gives 85% correct answers of 170 queries. Now, Alex, in addition, learned sound patterns as label for categories of color, shape, and material. So what does this allow to? So now the first characterization I just gave shows that Alex can recognize the color red in different objects, in squared objects, in triangled objects, and so on. He can now also recognize red as being part of the dimension of color. This can, in the case of Alex, shown because he is able to use the category color in parrot words, coral, something like that. And so you show him two different objects, a red wooden square and a red triangle made of glass. And you ask what's same. And he could answer with color, what's different, shape, material. So this nicely shows that he is representing red as a color and is also accounting for the neutral singles, additional singles in form of the questions, what's same, what's different. So the four criteria are in the case of the Alex studies nicely implemented. This is sufficient for having concepts, the concept of being red, not to be misunderstood. It's not arguing that Alex has the concept of color. He has the concept of being red. So, and now the question is, this was a single parrot. Is there more evidence that animals have the same abilities? And yes, these conceptual abilities, but now not for concepts of properties, but now for concepts of individual objects, is shown in border collies in several studies. The first one was the one done by Julia Fischer and Joseph Keil and so on, with a dog Rico, and he was able to recognize 200 objects by name. This was tested that the researchers took 10 objects out of the 200, put them in a neighbor room, and then the owner knew which 10 were there and asked Rico to bring Timmy, and that's what he actually did. And he was highly reliable in bringing these objects. This is now also confirmed with further border collie studies. The most famous one is that of Chaser, who actually was able to deal with 1,000 names of individual objects. And concerning conceptual representations, one may question here whether this is actually something that could be understood as really having a function of a signal or symbol, especially that involves the understanding that one thing, the name, stands for the object, or is it just bare association? I'm switching species, nevertheless, looking coarse-grainedly at animal cognition abilities and being aware that we have, of course, to account for the species. Nevertheless, I think that now switching to monkeys, olive baboons, and macaques, the study of Julia Fischer about symbolic representations nicely shows that in principle, some species, namely here the monkeys, are able to recognize that one object stands in for another one. So the idea of representing is realized. What is the study showing? How is it organized? So monkeys could choose between two amounts of food items, grapes. So in their cage on the left side, there's a plate with 2 grapes, on the right side with 5 grapes. What do they do? Interestingly, the monkeys choose a larger amount above chance, but only relatively at low levels, something like 68%. Now, the first move was to replace the grapes, put them under the plate, and substitute them by black pebbles. Now the monkey sees 2 black pebbles on the left and 5 on the right. What are they doing? They choose now the larger amount significantly more frequently, up to 85%. So this is significantly indicating an understanding that they get when they take the plate with the 5 pebbles, they actually get the 5 grapes underneath. Now the most interesting move was coming into play, namely food replaced condition. The food items, the grapes, are replaced by other food items of the same kind. So the idea is that the grapes they get to eat are again under the plate, while other grapes are representing those grapes which they actually get. So in this condition, where the monkeys have to choose the plate, they actually do well. They choose the larger amount significantly more frequently than in the standard food condition. Now in this food replaced condition, again over 85%, they took the larger amount compared to the standard condition of 68%. So it seems that they understand that the grapes, some grapes that look the same are representing other grapes that they get when they do their choice. So they have an understanding of symbolic representation, even though there are gradual limits in cognitive abilities. Especially we have to mention here that if you, even after that training, go back to the first condition, where you just now have the plates open and you have 2 grapes that you immediately get on the left and 5 on the right, then they are back to this low-level performance, indicating that maybe this attraction by food seems to be overwhelming, or that there is a limit in dual representations at one time. So now, again, that seems to be interesting that there is some semantic understanding of the bird Alex, also similar semantic abilities in border collies. There seems to be some evidence across species that non-human animals can have a kind of registration of representation. But why is all that still proto-language? So far, we have not seen anything like systematic recursive compositionality as highlighted in a paper by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch. Now, one could make an argument, which I make very short, but there is in 2011 the interesting observation that songbirds, exactly Bengali finch, are able to learn a syntactic structure or pattern which is recursive and similar to a Japanese language structure. Actually, very quickly, so you can train the songbirds by using the habituation idea. If they recognize something as they have just heard it as the same type, they stop reacting with surprise in their calls, and you can make use of that by having a special training condition now, where you say the structure is A, B, C, and now you double the A and you double the C and leave the B single. And this structure is actually similar to a Japanese syntactic rule. And if you put into the training conditions these 2 items and test the correct triple item here, which is built according to the rule, then you see the habituation effect in the Bengali finch, in contrast to other accidentally put together conditions which are not according to the rule, and they are recognized as new sound combinations. So these birds do not, but yeah, the observation is there seems to be at least something like an interesting recursive syntactic pattern recognition, but these birds do not have any relevant semantic understanding. So looking at non-human animals, we are lacking a combination of a significant semantic understanding with some recursive compositionality in the syntax. So this seems to be something that we at least not observed so far in any non-human species. So now coming back to this background that we have characterized concept possession as consisting in a certain cognitive package of cognitive abilities. And when we observe these package of abilities realized in the gray parrot Alex and in border collies, and maybe also in some other types of animals, maybe we find this kind of structure in what, where, when memory, but I leave that open. The next question is, which type of information is constitutive for having concepts? And here we can look at the philosophical debate. Which type of information is that if you have a certain conceptual information, a conceptual representation? There is a rationalist account of concepts. Concepts are, according to that, radically different in format from perceptual representations, and they are some kind of abstract symbol. Of course, Fodor is the most famous proponent. Tretzky and Peacock were actually further rationalists in this sense. So I think that looking at this argument, one can make a distinction here at this position. Fodor actually argues that there's a language of thought. Abstract symbols are decoupled from sensory motor representation. And I think this is actually false, as we are now looking in the next moment at the empiricist opponent position. But conceptual representations have a format, a structure that is different from sensory motor representation. And I think here Fodor was right. They have some specific informational structure, which I will work out in the third section. So the first position is that if we have a certain package of epistemic abilities, and we would like to speak about conceptual representations, what is its nature? Are they abstract symbols? I think no, because we have much more evidence for the empiricist answer. Concepts, according to the well-known position of Barsalou, Jesse Prince, and Pulvermüller, concepts can be fully characterized in terms of a network of associated perceptual information, including sensory-motor information. And an activation of a concept consists in a simulation or reenactment of the established modality-specific representations. From a bird's eye view, so the conceptual representations are perceptual symbols where they are actually transferring sensory motor and imagistic information. Now, we all know this kind of remind you only about the core evidence, at least this seminal study of Pulvermüller showing that the words to lick, to pick, to kick, in understanding them, we have a systematic activation of related body areas. The somatosensory cortex is actually activating in the case to lick mouth area, to pick the hand area, and to kick the foot area, which is nicely in line with this empiricist view. Maybe not so well known, but I also think very interesting for standard semantic perspectives is the study of Barsalou and colleagues in which they investigated sentences like a banana is yellow, a visual dimension, an airplane is loud, an auditory dimension, a coin is hard, a touch dimension. Now, what they did, before evaluating the truth value, whether the sentence is true or false, of course they had variations of the sentences, they actually gave a certain either visual stimulus, a sound, or a touch. So the person listening to the sentence, a banana is yellow, a visual sentence, actually had a very shortly preceding auditory stimulus or a touch. And the observation is, If the evaluation of the sentence is preceded by such a stimulus of a different sensory modality, the truth evaluation lasts significantly longer. So this also nicely indicates that truth evaluation is influenced by sensory motor modalities that are kind of incongruent with the content of the sentence, which I think nicely fits into the empirical study. And since truth evaluations are for some semantic theories also still the gold standard, I think this is really support for the empiricist view. But let me come to some challenges here. Abstract verbs versus concrete verbs were investigated by Rieschemeyer and colleagues, Frederici and so on. They had investigated abstract verbs like German, they did the study in German, greifen versus denken, to grasp versus to think. And they could show that the abstract verbs to think, even in the German modulation to comprehend, greifen, just change it to begreifen, so the same word source from greifen to begreifen, that there was the interesting modification that you observe the standard activation of the motor areas for the word greifen, to grasp, but there is no significant motor area activation in looking at the word to comprehend, begreifen. So that is really something interesting and challenging. Another, the same observation, to make it more shortly now, if you investigate the motor and premotor cortices for the verb to kick in isolation, you confirm the Pulver-Miller studies. But if you now investigate idiomatic phrases like to kick the bucket, then you don't observe it, while you find it in literal sentence like to kick the ball. So idiomatic sentences are also a challenge. So abstract verbs and idiomatic contexts where you use the verbs like to kick the bucket are indicating that we cannot take the empirical claim to be the full story. We need more information to come in. And I conclude that we need to include abstract or descriptive information as also clearly associated with some verbal phrases or with some symbols, to speak more generally. Now, let me argue that we need to integrate the role of affective information as well and of social information. First, having a look at affective information. Now, I'm again going back to very early, to very evolutionary, biologically anchored sources. And this is joint work with Piera Filippi, who was a fellow at our center. Together we looked at 9 different species. We actually asked human participants across 3 different language groups. So students who spoke as native language English, German, or Mandarin, and asked them to judge out of a pair of vocalizations from each species, which one was high arousal and which one was low arousal vocalization. And humans succeeded in doing this for 9 vertebrate species representing 3 different biological classes: amphibia, reptilia, mammalia. So this, I think, this is just a graph. I think that we are, so just to summarize, we found that humans are able to identify the different levels of arousal in vocalizations across all these species. And since the result was consistent across 3 different language groups, this suggests that this ability is biologically rooted in humans. So we have an evolutionary anchored sensitivity for affective information. We are sensitive for signalings of danger, of affective and emotional states, and we actually take this information as part of signals. Now, this is very primitive, but I think we are never losing this aspect of informational signals. To prove that, we actually have a look at a specific Stroop effect. I think it's also well known to everyone. First, I just remind you about the Stroop effect. We have a delay and an increase in reaction time if we read the word yellow, blue, and orange. And now in the case where we have to report the colors, if the word yellow is written in green as here, and you have now to report green, red, and blue as the colors of the first line, you are really slowing down. We use this effect to test synonyms now of emotion words. We focused on happy and sad and a lot of synonyms. Glücklich, fröhlich in German and so on. And now we could also easily produce an incongruent situation, namely we have the content of the word and we spoke it with a happy or sad prosody. So, and in the incongruent case, the dark blue, you see that the reaction time increases and that the accuracy of reporting the content decreases. This is exactly the Stroop effect, which I think indicates that at least emotion words are strongly influenced by the vocalization, by the prosody. We even did one follow-up study where we not only had the same thing as synonyms of happy and sad, which were spoken with happy and sad prosody, but we add an additional source of information, happy or sad faces that were displayed at the same time. So participants had three informationals, the face, the prosody, and the verbal content. And they could be in congruence, or they could be partially incongruent. So, and the general finding was that accuracy was lower when two channels expressed an emotion that was incongruent with the channel participant had to focus on. So, for example, if the participants had to focus on the verbal content, report the verbal content, but now the dark blue line is incongruent. Now the light, this medium blue, the second here, if the congruent was prosody and face, so the verbal content was incongruent with prosody and face, then the accuracy was radically going down. And the same was true even if only in the very dark blue, the prosody was the only one that was incongruent with the verbal content. So the face was actually congruent with the verbal content, only the prosody was incongruent. Then we had the same decrease in accuracy as seen with before, when two other informations were incongruent with the verbal content. This shows that prosody has a strong influence in processing signals. So vocalizations always transport affective information. In German, the tone makes the music, der Ton macht die Musik. If the signal or a symbol has an affective content, if a signal or symbol has an affective content, like the emotion words, then this understanding is strongly influenced by the prosody, while we have always some transport of affective information. Now let's have a short look at social information. And social information is characterized with the work with Simone Pica, who I'm also collaborating with. She has investigated gestural turn-taking. And the interesting point here is gestural turn-taking is the communicative function and embedded in joint travel. Signals, which are candidates for symbols, are always embedded in kind of social activity. And this is one which we observe regularly in monkeys and apes. So turn-taking in principle is characterized, as you all know in this community, there were quite some talks about turn-taking. One party singles at a time. There's a very short time window, up to 500 milliseconds, in which one has a reaction, and the techniques to allocate turns is observable. There's exchange of flexible bits of information, and this kind of interaction can be repaired. So it's not simply a very fixed, completely determined process of interaction that's going on. So here is an example, the video from the fieldwork of Simone Pica. So I'm grateful that she gave it to me. You can see the gesturing and the consequence that is realized here. So understanding signal consists in the understanding of others' goal-directed action or intention in a situation, while this is really understood in a low-level sense. So in general, what speech act theory highlights for human language has a parallel in proto-language, namely, signals and symbols have their meaning only in a pragmatic context of acting or planning. So far, this second part was dedicated to highlight the multidimensionality of meaningful symbols. So we not only have imagistic and descriptive and sensory motor and imagistic information, as the empiricists like Basalu and Jesse Prince argue. We have to include affective information, descriptive information, and social information, which are in parallel transformed when a signal is used in a certain pragmatic context. Okay, the third part. If we have this background, now the question is, what is the informational structure of concepts and how do they develop? Here, the working hypothesis is that concepts are organized as mental files, and using that background, we can outline the development from non-conceptual conceptual representations and also indicate how different types of concepts develop. I make use for the development of concepts out of either very primitive conceptual or even non-conceptual representations using the work of Frank Keil. It's a kind of old, but nevertheless telling. So in the 80s and 90s, he observed a shift from characteristic to defining features in the acquisition of concepts. He investigated a lot of terms, as you see here, without reading them, also from different categories. And what he actually could show, taking the term island as an example, so that 3-year-olds understand the term island only as involving some characteristic features, palm trees, sandy beaches, seashells, and so on, sunshine, swimming possibility, and nothing involved really the defining feature that there is a body of land surrounded by water on all sides. How can we characterize what's going on here in more detail? And this is making use now of the kind of frame representation used in Düsseldorf in the SFB and also inspired by Basalu's work. So if we have a conceptual representation of island, then in a very primitive representation, which may even be non-conceptual at the beginning, just the information is clustered, is associated, that you can do the activity of swimming, that there is a typical temperature of being hot, that there is a typical surface of sand, and so on. They are unstructured associated information. Now, in a further part, when children become up to 7 years, they structure the information and distinguish. On the left side, you have a kind of affordances, what you can do. You can do sports, especially swimming, and you can do your holidays, especially in summer. And on the right side, you distinguish properties of the object of island. It has a certain geography, and it has a certain climate. Sorry for this back and forth. Certain climate that is typically sunny and temperature hot. It has certain buildings like hotels, and all these features are now a little bit more organized, distinguishing at least subjective related affordances and objective typical features of the object. Finally, with 9 or between 7 and 9, we observe the shift that the children learn to understand the defining feature that it is a piece of land completely surrounded by water. What is the general characteristic of this organization of understanding concepts? We may even start with non-conceptual or very early on perception-based concepts, where there is no distinction between the accidental and typical attributes. You just cluster all the associated information together. Then you develop a distinction between merely accidental and more typical attributes in an intermediate stage, and in a ripe stage, you understand the theory-based concept. In this case, there is a distinction between typical and more definitional attributes of the concept, of the relevant concept. Okay, now let me transfer this kind of developmental picture into the framework of mental files. And the mental file heroes are, for example, John Perry. We may also mention François Recanati, and more recently in psychology, Joseph Perner, with whom I'm collaborating. And the idea is that a mental file is a kind of an informational organization, an internal specific informational organization that helps us to understand how we organize and integrate the information about one object or about a property. Here, about one object. Or actually the property of being a die. The property of being a die has a lot of descriptive information if you're a linguistic person. Made of rubber, rolls quietly, very good quality. You have perceptual information, how it looks like, affective information. For example, if you're an intense gambler, you may associate joy with the perception of a die, and you may have the social information of typically gambling with others. So this example illustrates what a mental file is, and of course, this idea of mental files has a lot of advantages in being helpful to characterize informative identity statements and so on. But now I'm focusing on what we can make use of to characterize concepts and their development using the mental file idea and integrating what I've developed so far. So just to repeat, concepts are based on an associative information network, which is integrated in a mental file such that now the linguistic expression is associated, or in more general, the symbol is associated with a unified package of information, and we may distinguish affective, sensorimotor, image-based or imagistic, descriptive and social information. And this information is anchored in a reference, a property, an object, an event, and in a certain situation, we also are able to structure this information in a certain way. And typically a mental file has a certain structure, but we can also restructure this at a certain moment. Now let us have a look at a certain typical structure of conceptual information. This is a perception-based concept. Think about a young infant of 9 months, which has a red puppet, and actually this, if I put in the descriptive information, now we have to think about maybe a 3-year-old, which is linguistic. Then we have all the information. Maybe there is the affective information of joy, and the 3-year-old has also the perceptual information of grasping this puppet, of smelling the puppet, also, of course, a perceptual image of the red puppet. It has the descriptive information, being my favorite toy, and being a puppet, and the social information, a present from grandma. So the 3-year-old has all this information integrated and unified and anchored in her favorite toy, this red puppet. Okay, so what does it help to think of information integrated in that way? We can now characterize the shift from perception-based concept of island to the theory-based concept of island very nicely as just indicating the constitutive information in such a mental file, the shift of the constitutive information in the mental file. If we have the concept of island and now focus on the perceptual information, which I'm not going to read, and the descriptive information of a 3-year-old, then the perceptual information may be in the foreground, that you can swim, you enjoy the sun, you have palm trees and sandy beaches and so on. And these are the constitutive information in the sense it is used to recognize an island. The shift to the theory-based concept is actually then represented by now making the descriptive information, being a piece of land surrounded by water, to be the constitutive information, but still keeping all the other information available and integrated. And since it is integrated and associated, you can also shift from a perception-based concept to a theory-based concept. And we, as adults, keep this performance and ability. Now, in this framework, we can account for varieties of concepts. We can account for concept of individuals, of this very red puppet, of properties, of being an island, of events, of processes, and so on. We can use the framework for characterizing action or perception-based concepts in contrast to theory-based concepts like to think, to praise, or to demand. We can account for the distinction between folk psychological concepts in contrast to scientific concepts, as well as the difference between external related entity concepts in contrast to mental or phenomenal concepts like red or pain. This cannot be spelled out here. This is just a claim that I partially worked out in papers just cited here. So this indicates now that we can account for different aspects of concepts with all these 5 dimensions that we have to account for, and that we can ascribe the developmental changes by changing the constitutive part of information that is relevant for recognizing, in the case of a property, of recognizing what is an island. You can change the constitutive information. You can change the constitutive information in this kind of integrated pattern of information organized as a mental file. One example to round it up, natural kind term water. We may have a lot of information, the perceptual information, how water looks like, the descriptive information, being a fluid, being transparent, being flavorless, and so on. And the important point in the natural kind term situation, that it is anchored in a certain sample. And according to Putnam and others, that's actually how the natural kind term works. it is that the constitutive determinant is not how it looks or any descriptive information, but the sample of water, which is the referent. We could, of course, also deal with, and children at the beginning actually seem to do that, take water to be a perception-based template so that we use the perceptual or descriptive features to individuate what we think is water. At least we seem to be very flexible in doing that, shifting from perception to theory-based concepts. Here is one example, an everyday case. You go to a student mensa and tell your colleague, this sausage, pointing to a vegetarian one, is not a sausage. It seems to be that in one sentence, the same type of word is used such that first, the word this sausage is used to express a perception-based concept. An object that looks like a sausage is not a sausage, expressing a theory-based concept and fulfilling the normally definitional criteria of a sausage. Okay, where are we? Let me round up. To possess a concept consists in having certain epistemic abilities, as I started out with. So we don't need a full natural language to possess concepts. Concepts are transporting multidimensional information. This includes the 5 types of information. Concepts are organized as mental files. And using this organization, we can outline in principle development from non-conceptual to conceptual representations. Let me just highlight the idea that what I characterized as perception-based concepts, just the associative package of information, maybe at the beginning just very minimal package so that it is not fulfilling the criteria combined with the epistemic criteria of possessing concepts. But then, as soon as the epistemic criteria are fulfilled, you may have just a minimal additional change of the associative package. And then this structure with the epistemic ability can develop further into certain types of conceptual information. As I highlighted, the shift from perception-based concept of island, focusing on the perceptual information, to the theory-based concept, focusing on the definitional information. So the conclusion is, gestures and symbols are used in the context of situated social interaction to convey information of multiple types, affective, perceptual, descriptive, social information. And this information is integrated for objects, properties, events, and it is structured like a mental file, which enables us to account for the variety of concepts. The development from non-conceptual to conceptual representation can be modeled as a restructuring of information in a mental file. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to my collaborators, which I have mentioned also in between.